Abhilash, Abhilash, it seems it's live.
Yes, sir. The great Renaissance ideal man, Philip Sidney, the great Renaissance ideal man, sir, I don't know what voice is not able to hear. Hello?
Yes, Abhilash.
Sir, YouTube voice, I think they are not able to make it louder.
I think it is fine. It will be louder. It is louder here. I can hear.
Okay, sir, fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. The great Renaissance ideal man, Philip Sidney, in his famous essay, Defense of Poesy, argued that poetry is a living picture. I believe it is not only poetry, but also each and every artistic creation is a living picture because they do. And when I use the word they do speak, I refer to stories because individual is associated with a specific story. And talking about story, Louis fall back upon a very famous line by Umberto Eco. He argued that to survive, must say stories. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And also, good afternoon and good evening to all. Just to reiterate, we have had registrations from countries apart from India. I, on behalf of All India Forum for English Scholars and Traders, Avilash Kaushik, the coordinator of this series, extend my heartiest welcome to each one of you. Today, this piece, we have our chief guest, Dr. Manu Mangattu. As we all know, this is going to be a long series, and every day we'll be starting at 11 o'clock, and then lecture will continue for an hour, and also after the lecture will be the question answers for half an hour. So, just to give you a brief introduction about our guest, Dr. Manu Mangattu is an English professor, poet, and editor. He has 9 books and has more than 90 research publications. He serves as the chief editor and also the editor for various international journals. He has also successfully completed funded research projects and also moved courses. Besides translations from Chinese, he writes poetry in English as well as in Indian languages. He was named Poetry China in 2016. A visiting faculty at various universities and excel Bohemian Vagabond, he conducts poetry readings, workshops, and lectures. After his stint in Shakespeare under Dr. Stephen Greenblatt, he currently offers part-time guidance to 23 research scholars from India and abroad. He also mentors net English aspirants. A great scholar, he also piles his trade in the film and publishing industry. Grateful to have you, sir. Now, I request Manu sir to deliver the rest of the day. Sir, over to you. The platform is all yours.
Good morning, friends. Thank you, Abhilash, for your kind words of welcome and introduction. I'm happy that we are having a very diverse audience today. I saw that we are having audience from as many as 23 different countries attending to this lecture. So, it's a matter of great privilege. but also it's exciting, but also a little challenging as well. And when I was thinking about giving a lecture to such a vastly plural audience, I was in fact having a few butterflies in my stomach, to be very honest. And you know, my dear friends, see, I would at the outset I would like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity, and I would also love to express my gratitude to all the participants who are here to attend this lecture series. I mean, this is just the first lecture. Great things are yet to come. This is just the beginning, just a starting. And today's lecture, the topic for my lecture today is Ex-centric disciplines, comparative cultural studies in context. Ex-centric disciplines, comparative cultural studies in context. You know, I want to tell you a story, a small story behind the title of this lecture. Why I titled it like this: Eccentric disciplines and comparative cultural studies in context. My dear friends, when the organizers came to me with this idea of the lecture series, they asked me to speak something on comparative literature, and I was telling that I had in fact spoken on comparative literature a month earlier, so I thought I would move on to comparative cultural studies. One step further from comparative literature, I would discuss comparative cultural studies, and I gave my topic as comparative cultural studies. And then something very interesting, something very startling happened. I was shared the brochure of this event by the organizers, and when I saw the brochure, something really startled me. I made a startling discovery, and this discovery kind of unsettled me. I was suddenly aware of an invisible presence, maybe behind me, maybe about me. I realized a presence, I felt a presence, and I immediately realized that I have to change my title for the lecture. And then I rephrased the title as Ex-centric disciplines, comparative cultural studies in context. Now, you might be wondering what this startling discovery and all this story is all about. My dear friends, there is a big name in comparative literature that left the stage of this world at the beginning of this year. Professor Mukherjee, the professor of comparative literature at the University of Hyderabad, she passed away in January 2020, leaving a huge vacuum, not just in the academic circles but also in the minds and hearts of her students and colleagues. So this term eccentric was something that Tutun Mukherjee ma'am was very fond of. Those of us who had been fortunate enough to have been guided, mentored and taught by her erudite self would remember her with a lot of gratitude and pride, and we would also remember the fact that she was an authority in the field of comparative literature in the country, in India, not just in India but in the world at large, because when you look at her publications, the books that she has published over the years, you will realize her greatness and her prominence as not just as a woman of letters but as a comparatist par excellence. Now, what startled me when I saw the initial brochure of this program was this. Professor Tutun Mukherjee has co-edited many books, and the term comparative cultural studies, the topic for our discussion today, comparative cultural studies, this term was coined by Stephen Tottesi de Sepetnik, a Hungarian comparatist. What Derrida is to deconstruction, Stephen Tottesi de Sepetnik is to comparative cultural studies. So he is a big name in the academy. Professor Tutun Mukherjee, she co-edited the Cambridge Companion to Comparative Literature, World Literature with Stephen Tottesi. Professor Tutun Mukherjee co-edited this particular volume, the Cambridge Companion to Comparative Literature. So, when I saw this, my title, Comparative Cultural Studies, I thought that I should pay tributes to my esteemed professor. But what was startling was some other coincidence. I was going through the remainder of the brochure and I saw the second name, and there it was written Professor Niladri Ranjan Chatterjee from the University of West Bengal. He was going to give a lecture on queer studies the very next day. And then I realized that the presence is real. The presence of Professor Tutun Mukherjee was real. Why? She co-edited not just the topic for my lecture, which is Comparative Cultural Studies, but she also co-edited a book with Niladri Ranjan Chatterjee. She co-edited this book, Androgyny and the Female Impersonation in India, the Nari Pav, the emotion or the female, the third gender emotion, androgyny and female impersonation. She co-edited this volume with Dr. Niladri Chatterjee, who will entice you and who will enthuse you, enlighten you with his hilariously enlightening lecture tomorrow. So what I am saying is, this presence is very much here, and I would like to, at the outset, I would like to offer this lecture as a tribute to the departed soul of Dr. Professor Tutun Mukherjee. My dear friends, now startling introduction apart, something else. I will borrow this term eccentric. As you will see, there is a difference between the word eccentric, E-C-C-E-N-T-R-I-C, and this word that I am using, eccentric. So I will borrow this concept of eccentricity, albeit used in a different, altogether different context by Professor Tutun Mukherjee, and I will borrow this term to explain the theoretical birth of comparative cultural studies. I am going to offer you a theoretical perspective into the birth of comparative cultural studies. My dear friends, let us look at the etymology of the word eccentric. Eccentric. What does X mean? The dictionary would define X as something that formerly held a specific position or place. For example, we speak of ex-boyfriend as an ex-boyfriend, somebody who held a place earlier. So X. Now we are speaking about eccentricity. Eccentricity. Think of Derrida's concept of the center and the periphery, and think of what has happened. Ex-centric. Think of the position of comparative literature once and now. Comparative literature has become ex-centric. Think of the concept of center itself, the very concept of center. Just think about the concept of center and you will realize that this concept of center is there an interruption? I can see some voices.
No, sir. It's fine. You can go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. So, I was speaking about the prefix X. What does this prefix X signify in a literary context? So, that is where I want you to look at the Derridean way of understanding the center. So, think of the word center itself or the concept of center. How central the concept of center was before Derrida came, before deconstruction came. The famous deconstructionist thinker Stephen O'Connor once stated that in the last 50 years of Western philosophy, no other concept has had as powerful an influence as the concept of center. So, center was very pivotal in the way everything was planned and arranged, everything was understood. But now, eccentricity, things have fallen apart, the center failed to hold, things have fallen apart. Center, my dear friends, when we speak of the word center itself from a deconstructionist Derridean point of view, we have to understand or locate the concept of center in the context of structure. It is the structure that gives the center its meaning. Of course, we live in a meaningless world. Derrida said there is no stable meaning. But, for our understanding, let us try to understand or position the concept of center in a structure. How does structure provide meaning to the center? Let us think of a traditional Indian family. I am very clear about my word, a traditional Indian family. Who is the center? We would say the father is the center of the family. Or let us look at the traditional classroom. Who is the center? Students would say that we are the center, but we know, in the traditional classroom at least, the teacher is at the center. Look at the literary activity. Look at a text. Who is at the center? The author is at the center. Now, my dear friends, the question is, what will happen if there is no center? Let us take the classroom. What will happen in a classroom if the teacher is not there? All students will sit quietly and study. They will read. No. They will make a lot of noise. There will be a lot of play. There will be a lot of play. Structure, sign, and play in the discourse of the human sciences. Without the center, there will be a lot of play. If the father is not at home, there will be a lot of play. Daddy, mummy, nahe karpe. So, what will happen if daddy and mummy are not at home? So, that song is a beautiful deconstructionist rendering, I would say, a beautiful example of deconstruction. Daddy, mummy, nahe karpe. So, center and structure and play. My dear friends, when I think of the word play, I have to give you some insights into comparative cultural studies as it is being practiced in some of the finest universities in the world today, like for instance the University of Copenhagen, the University of Houston, the Ohio State University, the University of New Brunswick. All these universities have separate departments and chairs and special core courses on comparative cultural studies. And when you ask those students who are studying there for a feedback regarding the course, if you ask them, my dear friends, what do you think about the course Comparative Cultural Studies, the feedback that they would give is simply mind-blowing, startling. Why? Because that is not something that we have heard. When we ask our students about their course, they will at best give a okay reply. Okay, it is okay, I can manage. Not very good, not very bad, it's 50-50. But these students in the West who attend the course of comparative cultural studies in these universities, their response would consist of words like open. They use these words to describe comparative cultural studies and their experience of learning comparative cultural studies at their universities. They will use words like open, broad-minded, lovely, new, exciting, stimulating, interactive, sensible, having variety. Some would say it gives us what we want, and some others would say it makes academics a very pleasurable exercise. I don't feel like I am in the camp. I don't feel like leaving the campus. Oh my goodness. We think that the students are lying, but there should be something about comparative cultural studies that makes it so appealing to the students. Why students love this comparative cultural studies? I would say there is a lot of play in comparative cultural studies. I will come back to that later. Now, coming back to our understanding of the word eccentricity. Eccentricity. Eccentricity means, for me, it would mean the perpetual, the everyday, the continuous, eternal, moving away from any kind of centrality. You are perpetually moving away from any kind of centrality. In what? In the choice of your subject matter, in your manners of representation, in your perspectives and personality, in your theory and analysis, you are moving away from any kind of centrality. This idea of eccentricity, moving away from the center forever, offers immense possibilities to generate both productive and counter discourses, I would say. Not counterproductive, but productive discourses and counter discourses. One may even argue that centrality, the concept of center, carries within itself the tacit implication of the margin. And it may happen that the margin could one day become the new center. The margin becoming the center. Does it happen? See, many of us believe mistakenly, quite mistakenly, we believe that post-colonialism is about replacing the white European male from the center and putting the colored man, the colored woman at the center. No. We would think that feminism is about exterminating or throwing away the man from the center and putting the woman at the center. No, that is a faulty way of understanding at least what Derrida meant when he spoke about deconstruction. But however, what has happened is whenever we speak of center, we are tacitly reminded of the margin. And sometimes it also happens, in reality it happens that the margin sometimes becomes the center. becomes the new center. For instance, look at what happened in comparative literature. Comparative literature began in the West with Goethe's proposition of Welt literature, world literature, and it gave a lot of importance to the idea of global citizenship, global ideas, one world, one country, one world, one humanity, one literature, world literature. And comparative literature gave a lot of importance to the idea of universality. Ideas like literature is the common property of all mankind. Common property of all mankind. So why do we need different literatures? That was the perspective in which comparative literature was understood earlier. But now what has happened? Now when you look at what has happened to comparative literature, especially in the 21st century, and that too in the third world countries, Asia, Africa, Latin America, the exact opposite is happening. There is a predilection for national literatures. Instead of world literature, comparative literature is growing only in those areas where they give importance to national literatures. And instead of the Eurocentrism that once dominated comparative literature, instead of that we will find something else. The West is being scrutinized from without. The Eastern countries, the Asian and African and Latin American countries scrutinize Western principles, texts, authors, everything from a non-Western perspective. The center shifted radically and almost into a diametrically opposite world. The West being scrutinized from without. However, this is not the deconstruction and decentering that Derrida envisaged. Never. No. For Derrida, it is immaterial who occupies the center and the margins. When he spoke of decentering, for example, when we think of decentering in feminism, we are not speaking about removing man from the center and putting woman at the center. That is not what Derrida wanted. He wanted us to do away with this sort of thinking. This sort of thinking about things in terms of binaries. This way of understanding and privileging one side of the slash. That is what Derrida wanted to do away with. He didn't want to privilege the margin. As Jonathan Culler, the famous author of Structuralist Poetics, as Jonathan Culler would famously say, deconstruction has to be done, decentering has to be done without the romancing of the margin. We cannot afford to romance with the margin when we are doing decentering. So this is another very important thing we have to keep in mind when we think of decentering and the idea of eccentricity. Eccentricity. Again, eccentricity would mean moving away from the traditional, the canonical texts. Eccentricity would mean breaching the binaries of power. Eccentricity would mean breaching the hierarchies of hegemony, as Antonio Gramsci would say, breaching the hierarchies of hegemony. And then what would happen? What will happen when we move away from these traditional centers of power, traditional binaries? What will happen when eccentricity becomes the reality? What will happen? New realms would open up. The lateral movement away from the center gives us a world of illimitable scope and diversity. Eccentricity would lead to exploring discourses of otherness. The other would come into the picture. Discourses of hybridity, displacement, alienation, marginality, ethnicity, identity, nationalism, regionalism, and so on. And so on. So many others who were, lurking in the margins, they are given a lot of importance when we do this eccentricity, when it comes to eccentricity. And what is the implication? This would mean not to think in absolute, not to think in absolute terms, but to think about ideas, think about concepts in specific terms. It means not to efface differences, but to develop a sensitivity towards differences. Yes, there are differences. Yes, there are differences, but it is not about effacing those differences, but about developing a sensitivity towards those differences. I hope I am making some sense. See, I am coming to the birth, the theoretical way in which comparative cultural studies was taking shape. And now we have to think about what is happening. The center, moving away from the center, we are giving importance to the other, we are giving importance to the marginal elements, hybridity, displacement, regionalism, other cultures, marginal cultures, ethnicity. Think about it. Eccentricity would demand that the discrete borders, the borders that we have erected between nations, between cultures, between languages and any such category, eccentricity would demand that these borders should become porous, should become transparent, it should enable an osmosis, to use a word from chemistry. See, think about what happens in a chemical process. A new compound is formed. That is exactly what we are looking at when we speak about eccentricity as something that demand the crossing or the porousness or making transparent the borders between nations, cultures, languages, to create a new compound, the synergy of which will surpass the sense of being merely the sum of its parts. The total, the whole, will be more than the part. And that is what comparative cultural studies is about. The whole is more than the sum of the part. And when I am talking about this, this might initiate some people who are familiar with Edward Said's ideas of filiations and affiliations. You would feel that this way of discussing things might initiate an examination of and an eventual move away from what Edward Said termed filiations towards affiliations. So when we think about eccentricity, moving away from the center, what happens is, in Edward Said's terms, we are moving away from filiations to affiliations. For those who are not familiar with this concept, in very brief terms, by filiation, Edward Said meant nature, and by affiliation he meant culture. So filiation refers to the descent of a person in nature. Affiliation refers to the process of identification through culture. He presents this idea in his very famous book, The World, the Text and the Critic. There he differentiates between the process of filiation, in which one is bound, you are bound to the place of your origin by your birth, by your nationality, or by your profession. And he differentiates this concept of filiality or filiation with the concept of affiliation, something that you acquire, a new allegiance that you acquire by social and political conviction, by economic and historical circumstances, voluntary effort, willed deliberation. So this is filiation and affiliation. So what I am saying is, when we think of centricity, eccentricity, we are in a way speaking about moving away from filiations towards affiliations. I will give you an example that would make things clearer. A critic, a student, she wants to juxtapose the writings of a woman writer from a privileged political class from a particular country with that of a middle class housewife. Okay, she wants to compare, juxtapose two things. She wants to juxtapose the writings of a woman writer from a privileged political class in one country with that of a middle class housewife, or a maid servant, or a tribal woman, or a sex worker from another country. Think of such an instance. So a comparison is being done of two women belonging to different social strata, belonging to different professions, belonging to different cultures, belonging to different countries. What happens here is, three processes are happening, I would say. A process of affiliation is happening, a process of juxtaposition is happening, and a process of dialogue is happening. In Derrida's terms, we could even say the critic, the student, when she does this, when she tries to juxtapose these two people, she is evincing, she is creating a politics of friendship. Remember the book by Derrida, one of his late publications, Politics of Friendship. This is what affiliations, juxtapositions, and dialogue can do. It can exemplify cross-cultural dialogue. Cross-cultural dialogue that happens across cultures, of one culture speaking with another, and thereby creating a politics of friendship, which would help. What would happen? It would help to examine how something can evolve, transform, mutate, or find variations in another culture. Just think of the example, the woman writer from a politically stable class in one country being compared to a Dalit woman from another country, a sex worker from another country. Think of the cultural discourse, think of the cultural dialogue that would happen in such a juxtaposition. So this is what eccentricity tries to do. My dear friends, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, in 2003 she came out with her book Death of a Discipline, and the discipline she was talking about was comparative literature. She said that more or less comparative literature as we understand then was dead. That was what Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak's idea was in her book Death of a Discipline. So after announcing the death of comparative literature, Spivak suggested something. Spivak suggested a politics of friendship. In fact, she suggested a friendship, a juxtaposition, a dialogue between two things: comparative literature on the one hand and area studies and cultural studies on the other hand. So she proposed a dialogue, a connection, an interchange, an exchange between the dead, more or less dead comparative literature on the one hand and cultural studies and area studies on the other hand. So according to Gayatri Spivak, what this dialogue would do is, cultural studies would solve certain problems of comparative literature, and area studies would solve certain other problems dogging comparative literature. So she was in a way suggesting some solution. Her solution was this: if you connect cultural studies with comparative literature, it could provide the Eurocentric comparative literature with a political corrective. So there was a mistake. There was a problem with comparative literature. It was strictly Eurocentric. It gave importance to European tastes and interests. That was something that was very wrong with comparative literature. And so Spivak points that out as one of the reasons for the untimely decline of comparative literature, and she suggested that by clubbing it with cultural studies, by ensuring an exchange between cultural studies and comparative literature, this problem of comparative literature can be solved. In other words, the Eurocentrism that characterizes comparative literature would dissolve when it comes into contact with cultural studies, because cultural studies has definite political implications, and so it can provide a political corrective to comparative literature. And coming to area studies, Spivak suggested area studies to enter into, or comparative studies to enter into a dialogue, into a friendship with area studies, so that it could extend its geographical frontiers by bringing within its purview, within its ambit, literatures from non-European cultures, non-European languages. So that was another drawback of comparative literature. It was narrow. It gave importance only to European interests, and it was limited to studying European literatures. But Spivak suggested, if you want to survive, if you want to escape from the tragedy that has befallen you, my dear comparatist, engage in a dialogue with area studies, because area studies is the one discipline that can help you extend your geographical frontiers to include non-European languages and literatures. And what Spivak was saying, what Spivak was endorsing with her arguments, was nothing different from what Stephen Totosi de Sepetnek was doing through his writings. Right from the 1990s, Stephen Totosi de Sepetnek, his name is very difficult to pronounce. Most of these modern theorists have very difficult names when it comes to spelling or pronunciation. Stephen Totosi de Sepetnek, Zepetnek. I hope you understand the person. So he was, as I told you, he is to comparative cultural studies what Derrida is to deconstruction. He is the father. He coined the term comparative cultural studies, and he outlined the theoretical premises of comparative cultural studies. So when we listen to what Spivak is saying in The Death of a Discipline, we understand that she was in a way echoing and endorsing the arguments put forward by Stephen Totosi de Sepetnek, which is an integration of comparative literature with cultural studies or comparative cultural studies. One small thing, Spivak writes that to be human is to be intended towards the other. Osmosis is flowing towards the lower concentration, and that is what we are doing in we want to do. Attention is paid to the margins, attention is paid to the less privileged. So Spivak writes that To be human is to be intended toward the other. Hence, the self, when Hegel coined this idea of the other, O with a capital O, the other with a capital O. The other is, the binary opposite of the other is the self. I hope you remember. So, Spivak's idea is that the self must seek its fulfillment in relating with the other. It makes a lot of sense in our current situation where we are, we are facing the torments of the corona, and man is trying to be empathetic and having a moral imagination to understand what the other feels. So Spivak was speaking about this, and she was saying that the self must seek its fulfillment in relating with the other. And when we explain that in terms of comparative literature, what she says is, to reinvent itself in the new world order, comparative literature has to endeavor to offer visibility and voice to eccentric subjects. Okay, so to remain important, to remain significant, Spivak suggested to comparative literature that if you want to survive, if you want to remain significant, you have to offer visibility and voice. You have to give a voice and give a face to eccentric subjects. Eccentric, the marginalized, the other. In this quest of the self or the singular text, when it comes to the text, it is the singular text, to find completeness in plurality. Think about it. Spivak said the self must seek fulfillment by relating with the other. So, the text, the singular text, must seek its fulfillment in the plurality of texts, in building relationships with other texts and contexts. And in this quest to enter into relationship with other cultures and other texts, to develop new affiliations, comparative literature took the shape of comparative cultural studies, or comparative cultural studies was born. The theoretical birth of comparative cultural studies. So this is the idea, how theoretically we can position the evolution of comparative cultural studies, the eccentric way, moving away from the center towards the margin and giving importance to the margin, which comparative literature required for its survival, and hence as per what Spivak said and Totosi Sepetnek articulated, comparative literature became comparative cultural studies by offering visibility and voice to eccentric subjects. Now, I have titled my lecture Eccentric Disciplines, Comparative Cultural Studies in Context. Hey, something is wrong. Why should I say eccentric disciplines? Shouldn't I be just saying just eccentric discipline? Isn't comparative cultural studies a discipline? I think it is not. When you look at the major theoreticians who have spoken about comparative cultural studies, their sentences are phrased like this: comparative cultural studies are a field of inquiry. Even if we use the word studies with very many different theories, very many different concepts, we speak about disability studies, we speak about, there are different studies, celebrity studies. So we say celebrity studies is, we say disability studies is, but we don't say comparative cultural studies is. The theoreticians give a plural designation to comparative cultural studies, and I think it is a very metaphorical way of looking at comparative cultural studies as well. The pluralistic nature of comparative cultural studies is very well embodied in considering comparative cultural studies as something plural. Why disciplines? So when we discuss comparative cultural studies, we are discussing not only comparative literature, we are discussing not only cultural studies, but also we are discussing comparative cultural studies, world literature, area studies, post-colonial literature, gender studies, LGBTQ studies. All these things, think about it, all these things come in a way under, I won't say under because tomorrow Niladri sir would cut me into pieces and he would systematically deconstruct whatever I would say, because he is an authority, an unbelievable authority in queer studies, and somebody whom I respect as, I think he is the best person to speak about queer studies today. So I will not venture into queer studies at all. Anyway, curiously, theorists and writers consider comparative cultural studies as plural, and that is why it is eccentric disciplines in the title. Okay, so I think I have made certain things clear, but it is not fully clear. For that, for better clarity, I would take you to through the intellectual or institutional birth of comparative cultural studies. I will say another story of the birth of comparative cultural studies. And this many of you would understand and might find more interesting as well. It is connected with theory but not theoretical per se. So, how comparative cultural studies gained a foothold in the academy, how it became institutionalized, how it became a subject taught and learned in the schools and in the colleges and universities across the globe. The institutional birth of comparative cultural studies. Now, my dear friends, let us go back to the 1970s and let us look at what was happening to literature studies. Derrida came up with his deconstruction, and then there were a flurry of theories which came one after the other and swept away all possibilities of determinacy and determinate meaning. I would say the advent of literary theory in the 1970s effected a paradigm shift in literary studies like never before. The way we understand literature has undergone a complete change with the advent of literary theory in the 1970s. So, literary theories encroached into literary studies, and there arose a lot of discussion. The discussion was centered around this. See, okay, we have literary theory, we have to accept it, whether we like it or hate it, we have to accept it. Literary theory is here and it seems to have come to stay. So no question about that. Now the question is, how should we fit this theory into the profession of literature? Or how should a university look at literary theory? How should a department of English literature look at literary theory? This was the question. This was the major bone of contention. And this led to a heated debate in the academic circles in the 1970s, 80s, and even into the 90s. This debate continued, and we call this debate the theory wars. the theory wars. So at one level, this theory war was a debate about the political ambitions of theory. So what are the power politics behind theory infiltrating into literary studies? So what will happen to literary studies because of these political aspirations of literary theory? So there were so many apprehensions on the part of the writers and critics, the professors at universities. So people were thinking together, putting their brains together and having a very heated debate, the theory wars. And at another level, and particularly from the 1990s onwards, the theory wars were addressed to vociferous arguments against theory. Theory wars. So the question was how literature would accommodate literary theory. So there were a lot of arguments, lot of heated debate, and that was followed by against theory. But against theory is a theory, and against theory is a theory that only helped theory. Whether it is against theory or for theory, it is a theory. And so against theory also fueled theory. Anyway, in the 1990s, there arose this against theory idea, which marked a conservative response to theory. When something is against, usually understand that it will be a little bit reactionary and conservative. So it was against theory was a conservative response, ranging from very cautious liberalism to downright right-wing assertion. Literary theory was basically left-wing politics. The political aspirations of literary theory was leftist. But against theory tried to assert the right-wing political aspirations of literature, and because of all this, there was a lot of controversy, lot of debate. And as the theory wars unfolded in the academic circles, three kinds of institutional response were discernible. I want you to understand this very clearly. There were three ways in which the academy, the colleges and the universities, what we call the academy or the institution. So there were three institutional responses to the theory wars. The first response was obvious. Theory was systematically introduced in courses and programs in literature. For example, an English department started having a paper or even a course on literary theory. This was the first institutional response to the theory wars. See, whether it is good or bad, whether it is for theory or against theory, what the academy would do is, it would look at what is happening in the world around, and it would want the students to learn about what is happening in literary studies, in literature, in academic circles today. And so naturally, literary theory made a very smooth entry into the academy. It was the first institutional response to literary theory, and it was very smooth. All the apparatus for this became quickly available. There were a lot of theory textbooks and readers. Lot of guides on literary theory became available in the market, and it was very comfortable. Literary theory had a smooth sailing into the institution, into the academy, especially in literature, language and literature departments. The first institutional response. The second institutional response, the second institutional response to the theory wars was that literary studies became interdisciplinary. Interdisciplinary not just in theory but also in practice. Jonathan Culler, I love this color because he gives some very beautiful quotes which you can use anywhere. So Jonathan Culler, in his book The Pursuit of Science, SIGNS, The Pursuit of Science, published in 1981. In that book, Jonathan Culler, as an institutional response to theory, he recommended collaborative arrangements between literary studies departments and departments such as philosophy, linguistics, anthropology, sociology, psychology, history, for the benefit of literature students. See, Culler's idea was very good. Culler wanted our literature students to benefit, and he wanted them to understand things better. And so he suggested that it would be great if literature departments in the world would collaborate with other departments so that the students of literature would get a feel of what is happening. For example, I will give you a very simple example. When we speak of literary theory, students are usually introduced to literary theory maybe during the third year of their graduation program. Major literary theories are introduced in the third year. But there is a school of thought that believes that it would be great if students are introduced to philosophy in the first year of their graduation itself. Why? Because literary theory has a lot of philosophical terms and concepts associated with it, and that is why when all on a sudden students are initiated into literary theory, they find it a tough nut to crack. So people suggest that it would be a great thing, and we have drawn the new educational policy, new syllabi will be made, and then maybe we can even think about doing this, having a philosophy course in the philosophy or anthropology, whatever it is, because literary theory has lot to do with so many other disciplines. So if we can give our students some insights into the major philosophical concepts in the first year itself, that would be a great way to initiate them into literary theory. So this was the way it was being understood, and so what happened? Literary studies became interdisciplinary. The second institutional response. The first response, literary theory entered the academy as a subject in literary studies, and second response, literary studies became interdisciplinary. And the third response is even more interesting, and something which is of very great import for our purpose. There were a lot of theories happening, and the English departments were collaborating with other departments, and a lot of literary theory was being taught to the students. And when people looked at what was being taught in literary theory, they realized that it had very little to do with literature, and it had a lot to do with philosophy, anthropology, culture, whatnot, philosophy, politics, sociology, all these things the students are studying in the name of literary theory. And so some professors, they asked a very innocent question. Why should we call this literary theory studies? Why should we call this a paper on literary theory? Shouldn't we call it cultural studies? Because this is what cultural studies was already in vogue, it was in fashion, and it was drawing a lot of funds and a lot of interest, very popular. There were chairs introduced at various universities, and it had great funding. Unlike the humanities departments, unlike the literature department or the comparative literature department, cultural studies department was getting a lot of popularity, a lot of attention. And so people were asking, see, we are teaching students in the name of literary theory, we are teaching them cultural studies, we are teaching them nothing about literature, and so why should we talk about literary theory? Instead we should talk about cultural studies, right? So this question This is the third institutional response, and it has certain other ramifications as well. It was a proposal for a theory-centered cultural studies, and it was a departure from literary studies. You know, there were occasional attempts in literary history, there were occasional attempts to take theory away from implicitly elitist institutional spaces of literary studies and find alternative spaces for cultural studies. So we should not study cultural studies together with literature. Rather, these people suggested that cultural studies should be taught separately. It shouldn't be a sub branch of the literature department. It shouldn't be something connected with literary studies. So we have to move it away from the literature department. And in the course of the 1980s and 1990s, numerous literary studies departments in the USA and the United Kingdom developed cultural studies sections within their fold. And in some instances, cultural studies broke away from literary studies and were constituted as new programs or departments. Cultural studies, the way cultural studies infiltrated into the academy, into the institution. See, cultural studies was already part of the academy, but until this breaking away, this formal breaking away with literature, no, we don't have anything to do with literature, we will remain on our own, we have our own individuality. This was what cultural studies was saying. And until this breaking away, until it broke away from the literature department, what was happening was cultural studies had remained a mere add-on course. It was looked at as a mere add-on course to the existing canons of writers and works. In other words, the literature teachers used cultural studies to explain their canonical authors and texts. But cultural studies said, with this theory wars and as an institutional response to this theory war, cultural studies slowly started breaking away from literature departments. And this breaking away, it turned from a mere add-on course, it turned into a full-fledged discipline, into a full-fledged course in the universities and the academies, cultural studies. And this breaking away was most lucidly conceptualized by Anthony Eastrop in the book Literary into Cultural Studies, published in 1991. So Eastrop's argument is very simple. He felt that theory had initiated a paradigm shift in literary studies which undermined the hegemonic ideology that is at the heart of literature itself, and hence Eastrop recommended a separation of cultural studies within which the political direction of theory could be more meaningfully realized. What was he saying? He said we should separate cultural studies from the literature department because literature department is not giving it due importance to cultural studies, and cultural studies has its own political aspirations. So we should free it from the chains imposed on it by literature studies, and we should allow it to flourish on its own so that its political direction, the political direction of literary theory itself, could be more meaningfully achieved, more meaningfully realized. And in the course of the 1980s and 1990s, due to the theory wars, due to this against theory, after theory, what happened was literary theory became institutionalized in literary studies completely. Literary studies became a part and parcel of every literary studies. For example, an English department will definitely have a paper or even an entire semester dedicated to literary theory. This was what happened in the academy during the period during and after the theory wars. Meanwhile, something else was happening to comparative literature. Poor comparative literature, what happened was, comparative literature was gaining some ground in the West when suddenly Derrida came with his structure, sign and play in the discourse of the human sciences, and these post-structuralist theories emerged. And because of that, what happened was, the high-flying graduate students in the West turned away from comparative literature towards literary theory. So students abandoned comparative literature and they embraced literary theory. So poor comparative literature had nobody, no student support. And in the 1980s and 90s, the comparatists realized that they were in real trouble and they felt the need to respond to the political impetus of literary theory. See, the problem was, literary theory had certain very definite political aspirations and comparative literature had nothing to offer when it comes to the political dimension of literary theory. Literary theory is always envisaged, I would say literary theory envisaged an emancipatory political desire. Literary theory has a political desire for emancipation. I don't say it is always practical, but theoretically, literary theory is about emancipatory political action. It has that desire to emancipate the margins. The political thrust of literary theory led to the emergence of many sub-disciplines. And what happened? These sub-disciplines were slowly taking away the space occupied by comparative literature in the academy. The prerogatives of comparative literature began slipping into these sub-disciplinary spaces within literary studies that literary theory had given rise to. So, canonical literatures, English and American literatures, all these gave importance to comparative literature at one time because it had certain things to do with certain sub-disciplinary categories like post-colonial studies, black studies, women's studies, gay studies and so on. But the political thrust of theory made it sure that nobody would again go to comparative literature because these sub-disciplinary spaces had a lot to offer and comparative literature had nothing to offer. So, in keeping with the political aspirations of literary theory, literary theory was primarily identity centered. Comparative literature, nation centered. Literary theory, identity based or identity centered. That is, literary theory wanted to interrogate identity politics, and comparative literature could at best interrogate national politics. So there is an incompatibility. And so comparatists in the 1980s, late 1980s and 1990s, they realized that we have to immediately shift from this nation based approach to an identity based approach so as to include the political aspirations of literary theory into its fold. Until then, comparative literature was rooted in the concept of universals, world literature, and it was Eurocentric. The world as one, literature as the common expression of humanity, very beautiful universal values, but nobody to follow. But now, with literary theory, comparative literature realized that it had to change. Comparative literature had to change if it had to survive. And so, Vlad Godzig, in his essay, Emergent Literature and Comparative Literature, not a very famous essay, but he says something very interesting that led to the emergence of comparative cultural studies much later. So, in his essay, he exhorted comparatists to align the discipline of comparative literature with the larger political trends of the time. We have to change with the changing times. He said, my dear comparatist friends, we have to change with the changing times. We have to make sure that we give space to the political trends of the time. Otherwise, we will become extinct. He says, I will quote, he says, it is incumbent upon comparatists to inquire into the relationship of culture to its other, or with a small o. Culture to its other. What is it? Cultural studies. Or in other words, he was saying that comparative literature has to look at cultural studies for some inspiration. This was what Godzik had to say. And then in 1993, Charles Bernheimer, he gave a very detailed report to ACLA, American Cultural, American Comparative Literature Association, and he published a book titled Comparative Literature in the Age of Multiculturalism. In this book, Charles Bernheimer recommended comparative literature syllabus to include ideological, cultural, and institutional contexts. And he also asked comparative literature to play an active role in multicultural recontextualization of Anglo-American and European perspectives. Charles Bernheimer, a comparatist himself, he was asking his fellow comparatists, he was telling them that to survive, we have to play an active role in the multicultural recontextualization of our perspectives. In other words, we have to do a cultural studies comparative literature. This need was being felt, and one of the responses to this argument made by Bernheimer was a paper by Ray Chow, C-H-O-W, R-E-Y, Ray Chow. He came up with a paper in the name of comparative literature. And there what he said was very simple. My dear Bernheimer, what you say is very correct, that comparative literature has to look at cultural studies for inspiration, and we need so many things from cultural studies for comparative literature to survive. But he was saying, but the question is, I don't find any difference between what you are saying and what comparative literature is cultural studies is already doing. What you intend to do is what cultural studies has already been doing. So he advised very calmly, Chow advised comparatists that don't simply resist cultural studies. Initially, comparatists were completely against cultural studies, but Chow said, please stop resisting and arguing against cultural studies. Stop resisting and discrediting cultural studies. And he says, comparative literature could borrow from cultural studies by way of opening itself to the study of media other than word-based literature. So the stage was being set for the merger of comparative literature and cultural studies, the marriage of heaven and hell, comparative literature on the one hand and cultural studies on the other hand. And Stephen Totosidis Zebetnek, he found it very irritating as a comparatist that approaches and studies in cultural studies purport to be innovative when in fact the same areas have been studied under similar terms in comparative literature. Sepetnek was saying this. He was saying, you cultural studies, you are doing naughty things. I don't like you. Why? Because we are already doing these things, and why are you taking our concepts and our ideas and our methodologies and doing it as cultural studies? No, this is not fair. This is what Sepetnek was telling the cultural studies practitioners. However, this same Sepetnek, what he recommended was a turn towards what he designated as comparative cultural studies. He said this, he complained that comparative literature is stealing ideas, cultural studies is stealing ideas from comparative literature, but what he suggested instead was a merger. He suggested comparative cultural studies. Because why? His reason was very simple. Comparative literature had no money. That could be the only practical reason why he should do this. So his problem was there was a lot of financial difficulties faced by comparative literature in the Anglo-Saxon academia, and the flowing of grants towards cultural studies was very enticing. Lot of grants for cultural studies and nothing for comparative literature. So maybe because of that he suggested that we want a comparative cultural studies. And he didn't stop there. He edited and published several books and papers arguing for a rapprochement, a bringing together of cultural studies and comparative literature, which recommended a merged field of comparative cultural studies. And for sure, the institutional incarnation of comparative cultural studies had happened. So this is how comparative cultural studies entered the institution, entered the academic space in our colleges and universities. Thus, comparative cultural studies can be understood as a merger of the tenets of comparative literature and cultural studies. But there are two small clauses. Comparative literature minus its we want comparative literature and cultural studies together for comparative cultural studies, but comparative literature should come for this marriage after divorcing its ex-boyfriend. What is that? Its interest in Eurocentrism and nation orientation. So comparative literature minus Eurocentrism and nation orientation. That was the one condition of this marriage between comparative literature and cultural studies. And cultural studies said that I would bring along with me my political and ideological perspective. So this was the condition. Comparative literature would forget its Eurocentrism and nation orientation to facilitate this merger with cultural studies, and cultural studies on the other hand would bring along with it its ideological and political perspectives into comparative cultural studies. My dear friends, comparative cultural studies is not a master theory. It is a framework. It is a framework among several other theories. And in this merger, in this union between cultural studies and comparative literature, into comparative cultural studies, what has happened is there was a great, they were made for each other. They were made for each other. How? I called it a marriage of heaven and hell, but it was they were made for each other. They were mutually complementary. They aided and abetted each other. Whatever one was missing, the other supplied. If comparative literature was lacking in something, cultural studies supplied. And if cultural studies missed something, comparative literature supplied. So it was such a bond, it was such a great bond between comparative studies and cultural studies in comparative cultural studies. I will give you certain criteria where this merger became so beautiful. First one, popularity. Comparative literature wasn't popular at all. Its history was very troubled in the West. But despite comparative literature's proclaimed objection to cultural studies, it agreed for a merger with cultural studies because cultural studies was immensely popular. And by merging with cultural studies, comparative literature also started gaining in popularity. First thing. Second thing, survival, existence. Comparative literature was struggling for breadth, was struggling for survival, and it was as good as dead in the West. In cultural studies, it found an able ally. And in comparative cultural studies, comparative literature started breathing again. But don't think that it was comparative literature that benefited always from cultural studies. No. Cultural studies had its drawbacks. Cultural studies, the problem with cultural studies, one major drawback of cultural studies was its monolingual state of affairs. Monolingual, one language. It was a field developed and practiced primarily in the English world, Anglophone world, by scholars who in general worked maximum with two languages. That's it. And hence many people criticized cultural studies of monolingualism, or it doesn't give importance to other languages. And hence, and what is comparative literature? It is comparative literature's area. It deals with a lot of languages, whether it is through translations or whether it is through comparison, juxtaposition, influence, adaptation, whatever it is. Comparative literature is so full of languages, and hence the notion that what has been a trademark of comparative literature, namely its ability to work with multiple languages, ideally got carried over into comparative cultural studies. And so cultural studies got rid of its major problem, that it was monolinguistic. That now with the merger with cultural studies, comparative literature gained in, cultural studies gained in linguistic appeal. It started dealing with many languages. Another criticism leveled against cultural studies was that it lacked contextual pluralism. In most cases, it lacked a contextual, pluralist, supranational range and depth of thought and application. Pluralism. Comparative literature is all about pluralism, and comparative literature readily obliged. So, comparative literature had plenty of pluralism, and it shared its pluralism with cultural studies, and comparative cultural studies was perfect in that respect as well. And then there was another problem, a problem that both the disciplines suffered from, a lack of a proper method. See, comparative literature had a method, but it was just a matter of fine-tuning its method. Whereas cultural studies was searching in the dark. It didn't have a proper method at all. What am I saying? Why am I saying there is no method? See, my dear friends, think of cultural I would say students would appreciate this better. They would understand this better, because when they make topics for their MA projects or MPhil thesis or PhD thesis, they have to create their topics, and when they create topics, they encounter a problem. They can speak about a comparative reading of something, a comparative study of something, a deconstructive reading of this text, a post-colonial reading of this text, a feminist reading of that text, but they cannot speak about a cultural studies reading of a text. Why? What is the problem with this cultural studies? If I just, so students are worrying, can I say cultural reading of this particular novel? Then will it become cultural studies? So, there is something wrong with cultural studies, with its methodology. It didn't have a well-defined methodology. Meek Bal, a very important critic when it comes to critiquing cultural studies from within for its lack of method. He says, Meek Bal says, I will quote, "Cultural studies has not been successful in developing a methodology to counter the exclusionary methods of the separate disciplines. While the object of study has changed, the method has not. Cultural studies does not have a proper methodology. This is what Meek-Bal, M-I-E-K-E-B-A-L, Meek-Bal had to say. So, what you study changed, but how you study it didn't change with cultural studies. So this was a major problem with cultural studies, and this inability of cultural studies to devise a coherent method was the principal problem in imagining cultural studies as a separate discipline. See, to consider something as a discipline in its own right, of course it needs content, but content is not the only thing. It must have a proper method. Without method, an area of study cannot be considered a discipline. Howsoever wide and wild its selected texts and writers are, it is not enough for the establishment of something as a separate discipline. And cultural studies had this big problem. It didn't have a proper method. And here too, with this merger, there was a wonderful solution. Comparative cultural studies. The answer is very simple. What is the method? Comparison. Comparison is the method. And please understand, when we speak about comparison here, we do not and we must not imply hierarchy. In comparative cultural studies, there is no mention of hierarchy. There is no recourse to hierarchy. There is no hierarchy. It is the method used rather than the subject matter that is of importance in comparative cultural studies. So we don't think about, when we compare, sometimes we think that comparison is about finding which is longer and which is shorter. No. Here the importance is given to the method of comparison itself without worrying about hierarchy and without thinking about things in a hierarchical way. And that is why they use the word dialogue. Instead of comparison, their method, I would call it dialogue. And dialogue is understood as, the connection between comparative literature and cultural studies, or the method of comparative cultural studies is dialogue. And this dialogue is inclusion, which extends to all other marginal, minority, and all that has been considered peripheral, and thus it is an approach against all essentialism. Dialogue as an exercise against essentialism. All absolute values were thrown to the dustbin, and the peripherals, the marginals, the others began to be given importance in comparative cultural studies. And its method is both active and creative, like cultural studies. Of course, comparative cultural studies do not assume that consumers of cultural forms, we are consumers. When we think about it in cultural studies terms, we are consumers of cultural forms, whether we are students or audiences or readers or believers or bystanders, whoever we are consumers of cultural forms. Comparative cultural studies believe that we are not passive consumers, or the process of cultural consumption is not passive. Instead, comparative cultural studies invite students to see themselves also as potential producers and authors of creative analysis of new cultural theory, and as creators of alternative cultural forms. This was what was happening in the method of comparative cultural studies. Thus, its approach is both interdisciplinary and cross-cultural. It is about learning about the cultures and then learning about the theory behind how these cultures interact, and then applying these theories to both theoretical and practical situations using empirical methods. This is the simple way in which comparative cultural studies do things. And what are the goals of comparative cultural studies? I would just list a few goals for you to just get an idea what comparative cultural studies does. Its first goal is to give the practitioners with the skills and the knowledge necessary to understand and work in cross-cultural and global contexts. You need the knowledge as well as the skills to work in cross-cultural global context, and comparative cultural studies aims to provide that. Second one, to develop a broad and a global perspective, to help us develop a broader perspective devoid of narrow, parochial, national, political considerations. Third goal of comparative cultural studies, to compare cultures from different diverse disciplinary perspectives. Fair enough. To understand cultures better by juxtaposing. See, to understand something better, comparison is a very useful method. Remember what Ezra Pound said. He said that in chemistry you cannot understand the reaction of a chemical substance by adding more of itself. You have to add something else for a reaction to happen. Likewise, to understand the property of a particular culture or to understand a culture better, it is always ideal to compare it with another culture. So, to understand our culture better by learning other cultures, juxtaposing cultures. And another goal, to explore the universals of human experience. And from an academic perspective, I would say for the students, comparative cultural studies, the goal of comparative cultural studies is to provide students with the intellectual tools and the interdisciplinary vocabulary items to work in the complex networks that define cultural production around the world. Our students have to go around the world and they will be working in different cultural milieus. They will have to interact with different cultural products, and while doing that they should not be found wanting. They should not be found wanting either in knowledge or tools or their vocabulary. So this is what comparative cultural studies aim to do to this through its practice. And a practical way of understanding how comparative cultural studies how it works. See, I would give you the example of globalization. Thanks to globalization, our world has, I don't say thanks because it has brought the virus as well, but still, thanks to, in a another sense, due to globalization, our world is increasingly becoming more and more interconnected. I'm saying before the lockdown came. So, what is it? With globalization, it is simply exciting to see how cultures can be geographically very distant but have interesting similarities and differences. And when I understand different cultures, the similarities and differences between my culture and other cultures, I am better prepared to deal with encounters with the foreign. Encounters of the foreign, and this encounter with the foreign is almost inevitable. Not now, but when this lockdown and everything is over, we will again be back with encountering the foreign. So, because of our increased mobility due to globalization, migrants, immigrants and newcomers, they change the landscape of our mindscapes as well, of our environment very rapidly. And so it is very necessary for us to have insights into other cultures to help us interact better with other people and other people from other cultures. we can see this very clearly now, what is happening, how certain countries are very good towards people from other cultures, especially in this lockdown and corona situation, while some other states and some other countries are very hostile towards foreign cultures suddenly. Yes, we had globalization and everything, but when an illness, when an epidemic is staring at you, then people's real character comes out, and this is what we see here. So now this is a practical way of understanding how comparative cultural studies work. It is also enriching and in fact empowering, I would say, to know more about other contemporary cultures, as it may help us to enlarge our radius of action, to inspire our students to participate in mobility, to travel. See, it is important that students from very rural areas also feel that urge and feel empowered to travel, to explore different cultures, not just for for entertainment, but for learning, but for diverse purposes, to enhance knowledge, we would say. And when you look at a comparative cultural studies department in any college or university, you will realize that it is a very original department. There is something very unique about the comparative cultural studies department. In some universities, comparative cultural studies was configured building on the legacy of the world literature and cultural studies program. In some other universities, comparative cultural studies has replaced comparative literature. Some other universities, it has replaced cultural studies. In some other universities, it has fused the comparative literature department and the cultural studies department to make the comparative cultural studies department. But there ends the connection with the other disciplines. Otherwise, the comparative cultural studies department in our academy is very unique and individual. They don't see comparative cultural studies as a program in cultural studies. It is not a sub branch of cultural studies. It is not a sub branch of comparative literature. Rather, based on the framework developed by Stephen Totosidi Sepetnak, these departments have developed an approach that combines elements of comparative literature with cultural studies, and their courses are aimed to be comparative in orientation, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, and transnational. And because it is taught by teachers from different disciplines, students get exposed to different perspectives as well. This is a huge advantage with comparative cultural studies. And I would wind up I would wind up with a short discussion on why students love comparative cultural studies as a degree program, as a program of studies, for whether it be for MA or BA or MPhil or PhD. Students love comparative cultural studies programs. Why? One reason, it fosters in students an intercultural literacy. It enables them to appreciate their own values in the context of other cultural systems and gives them a broadened awareness of global realities. It inculcates an ability within our students to see beyond our own borders, while not disregarding the need to expand our understanding of what goes on within the boundaries, but how to become a global citizen. This is what comparative cultural studies teaches our students. Such courses teach our students to be global citizens. And a student with this degree will have the skills that will allow them to be strong contenders for any career choice. any career choice. They will have skills allowing them to interpret, to relate, to communicate, to compare, to analyze, to present, to articulate ideas, to develop solutions and be creative. And these skills are always in high demand for all kinds of careers. It gives you an increased ability to put yourself in the shoes of others, in the shoes of somebody else from a different background, and thus to be more comfortable in foreign contexts. A great advantage. And this intercultural competency, this global competency means that you are adaptable and flexible, and you may solve challenges of new situations far better than someone else who has never encountered such differences, ethnic or cultural, and had the opportunity to reflect upon them academically. So overall, its theoretic base is very strong when it comes to comparative cultural studies as an academic discipline. You know, students always, most often students don't know which subject to pick as a major for their BA program or MA program. They do not know which topic to choose. Very few students are very sure about it. So they will go to an educational counselor, a career guide, and the guide will tell them that, okay, you must pursue the career of your choice. You must do what you are interested in. Okay, the student is happy. Okay, so I should study something that suits my interest. So the student is very happy. Then the next question is, what is your area of interest? The student would say, well, I love sports. But there are no courses in sports. Think of something academic. Well, I love traveling. Traveling is beautiful, no. But there is no course in traveling. I love television. But there is no course in television. I love video games. No course in video games. I love modern technological gadgets, the mobiles. I love them. There is no course with technological gadgets. Think of something else. See what is happening. There are no courses. They will tell us that you should pursue your dreams, you should follow your dreams, you should pursue the career of your choice. But many of us are here today because we couldn't get what we wanted. And so either somebody forcefully put us into this art stream, or we half-heartedly chose this. Very few people actually choose their careers according to their likes and dislikes. So the thing is very clear. If you are interested in something, you will enjoy it more, and you will be more inclined to work hard. The advantage with comparative cultural studies is it does not have any prerequisites, knowledge related prerequisites, and it will be suited for which students can choose comparative cultural studies. And my dear students, you will be very interested in this. I will tell you some of the subject areas that you will get to study in comparative cultural studies. See, this program doesn't have any prerequisite, and it will be suitable for students who enjoy arts, music, cinema, reading, traveling, fashion, languages, whatever it is. It is well suited to those who are curious about customs and cultures of other countries, as well as their own environment, and who would like to better understand the world and the power of culture to shape our world. If you are interested in any of these, comparative cultural studies is your area. And let me name some of the courses that they offer, some of the subjects that they offer in comparative cultural studies for bachelor's and master's courses. I will read out a few. For master's courses, the subjects: sports journalism, music therapy, fashion designing, legal humanities. Nice, na? And for PhD, see, people are doing PhD on topics like the social dimension of dance, cultural reception of painting, sports aesthetics, celebrity studies, fan culture, digital humanities, art history. Good. Very good choices we have. And let us look at the optional or the elective papers that many of these universities offer. Museum studies, sexuality studies, popular cultural studies of popular music, the city and culture. These are all subjects you will get to study if you choose a course in comparative cultural studies. Think of it, and you can choose which you want. Nothing is forced upon you. You can choose which all subjects you want to study. Religion and politics, gender and religion and environmentalism, film and literature as narrative art, history of literacy, studies in ethnography, the art of hosting, poetry and politics, magic, religion and ritual, history of jazz music, zombies, the anthropology of the dead, of the undead, video games and the individual, rhetoric and social action, global architecture, American cartoons, history of photography, silent cinema, documentary cinema, Korean martial arts, sex and love in modern society, history of modern theatre, musical theatre, queer studies, Hollywood and women. My dear friends, it's so vast, and isn't it interesting? I hope you now understand why those students used those very beautiful adjectives to describe their experience of being students of comparative cultural studies. So this is the purview, the vast purview of comparative cultural studies, and I would say that 80% of whatever we are doing today in our academic, literary, cultural activities, 80% of them belong to comparative cultural studies. Maybe we can say that there is nothing outside of culture. Who knows? So I wind up. Just one thing. What is happening to comparative cultural studies in Asia, Africa and the third world? Comparative literature flourished in Asia and Africa and the third world when comparative literature was floundering in the West. Now what is happening for comparative cultural studies? Comparative cultural studies is a field of study with intellectual relevance, yes, but with limited institutional presence, especially in Asia, Africa and the third world countries. Very limited institutional presence. We look around and we see that there are I don't know any university in our countries where we have a complete department for comparative cultural studies. We don't have. I don't know, maybe you can correct me. So the institutional presence is very minimal, very limited in Asian, African and third world countries for comparative cultural studies. And with the revamped educational policy offering multiple choices for students, students are asked to have both majors and minors as their subjects. The focus will be more on the practical application of knowledge by students, and I am very sure that comparative cultural studies will be seen more and more as a viable option by many departments in the coming days. See, why? To counter the falling numbers. People are no longer interested in comparative, literary or humanities subjects. The waning interests of students and parents and the stakeholders in humanities subjects. All these problems can be solved with, I don't say it will be solved, but there is a possibility that comparative cultural studies can bring a lot of students into the humanities. And we need comparative cultural studies to ward off the competition from vocational courses. our English departments need comparative cultural studies to stay abreast with the changing world order. I am not going into how digital humanities as a part of comparative cultural studies can be of great use today. I am not going into any such details because everybody should be tired, I can imagine. So I wind up, but think of the possibilities. Think of right from Matthew Arnold, think about it. Think of what Arnold said about culture in his Culture and Anarchy, and how those ideas can be read deconstructively, if you want, from a comparative cultural studies point of view. Think about how digital humanities is a part of comparative cultural studies, and how digital humanities is going to be a major force in the changed world order. All these things are areas you can work on. Comparative cultural studies is a viable and exciting choice for our students at the degree, master's and PhD levels. And when the syllabi of Asian, African and third world countries are revised, my dear teachers, my dear professors, my dear great people who are listening to me, please give it a thought. Just a suggestion. Of course, it should not be at the expense of literary studies or comparative literature, but still, as an exciting alternative for our students and teachers alike, why can't we give this comparative cultural studies a chance? Once again, let learning be a lot of fun. Thank you. So that concludes my lecture on comparative cultural studies in context.
Thank you so much, sir, for this incredible lecture. I really like to thank you on behalf of AIFEST. And our question answer part is still remaining. So now next part is question answer part. And now I would like to request our participants present here, and whatever your question you can write here in chat box, and your questions will be carried forward by Abhilash, and he will put forward your questions, and all the other instructions will be given at the end of that part. So please remain present. And now I would like to invite Abhilash.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sneha ma'am. Okay, now we'll be having the question answer round. Sir, we have received numerous comments. Undoubtedly, they are related to you. They are about your lecture, they are about your way of presentation. I'm not going to deal with all of this, but I have observed something very unique. I have received a comment based on your lecture and also based on the topic. It is by Madam Chitradas Gupta. I would love to read that out, sir.
Okay.
Madam says that we can realize the carnivalesque potential of cultural artifacts and reactive yet responsive appreciation thereof in comparative cultural studies. This is the unique affiliative potential of the domain.
Definitely.
After that, she goes on to say that we can also connect the vast domains of translated writings, because she believes that translated writings is the strength of that very domain. What is your view on that, sir?
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that 100%. I didn't dwell on translation studies at all because of time constraints, but definitely, comparative literature was not very receptive to translation studies during its heydays, comparative literature was not very happy with translation studies, and the relationship between comparative literature and translation studies was always very strained. And Susan Bassnett speaks about the relationship. She says that we don't know whether comparative literature is a sub-discipline of translation studies, or whether it is the other way round, because once we thought that translation studies was a sub-discipline of comparative literature, but towards the end of the 20th century, there was a greater realization among scholars and thinkers that comparative literature is in fact a subcategory of translation studies. Anyway, the relationship between comparative literature and translation studies was very strained. But that is not the case when it comes to comparative cultural studies. In comparative cultural studies is very open in its approach to translation studies, because cultural studies right from its inception had a great connection with translation studies, because it was the feeding system for cultural studies. Translation studies provided, it is a part of cultural studies definitely. Translation studies and cultural studies are very closely aligned, but also cultural studies benefited immensely from translations. We know that cultural studies is about the production, reception, consumption of cultural products, including texts, and all these required translation in great deal as well. And cultural studies had always a very good relationship, I guess, with translation studies. Comparative literature didn't, but with the merger of comparative literature with cultural studies through this comparative cultural studies, as Madam has rightly pointed out, there is a lot of opportunity for translation studies to contribute, and it is very important as well. Whatever comparative literature said about translation studies, we know very clearly that we need translation studies, and it's a very relevant point. Translation studies will play a key role in the future of comparative cultural studies, that is for certain.
Thank you, madam. Your observation is really unique. Now, moving on, I would love to pick up our first question. It is by Mr. Somnath Desmokia. He asks that radical feminism did aim at decentering men. Please throw some light on it.
He says radical feminism decenters men, right?
Yes.
Well, Desmukhya sir, Somnath sir, yeah, he's my good friend. I understand your question. Many a time, maybe from experience, we understand that radical feminism decenters and demolishes and destabilizes men. I don't know, but theoretically at least, feminism in itself doesn't, I have to be very political in my statements, right? So it is a platform like this. So feminism doesn't aspire to decenter men or to take men away from the center. The original idea, as I told you about the concept of the center and the margins, the original idea is to do away with this kind of binary opposition of thinking of man and woman as two sides of the slash, and privileging men and marginalizing women. This is what we wanted to do away with. That is what feminism wanted to do away with. Yeah, but we have had instances in feminism, especially in radical feminism, with people like Shulamit Firestone and others. They are arguing that, there were so many arguments. I'm not going into the details because I'm not a great scholar in feminism either. But yeah, it may be a reality, but in practice, it is not. And if at all, if it is a reality in some theoretical realm somewhere, it is not the case everywhere. in most places the situation hasn't changed. Despite the best efforts of feminism, the condition of women hasn't improved a great deal. Yes, we are trying to speak about empowered womanhood, and feminism is bringing women to the foreground. But when you look at the stratification of our society and the women, the status of women from very financially or academically impoverished conditions, their situation hasn't really improved. So, well, it should improve, but my views are limited to that. It should improve, and it should be done. Yeah.
Okay, then we have our next question from Madam Fatima.
Yeah.
She wants to have some idea about Indian English literature.
Indian
English literature.
Indian English literature.
Yes, sir. She wants to have some light on that.
Okay, Indian English literature. I guess she wants to understand Indian English literature in the light of comparative cultural studies, perhaps.
Most likely, yes.
Yeah. So, well, what has happened in the Indian scenario as regards comparative literature is very interesting. As Swapan Majumdar pointed out, comparative studies in India took roots, or comparative studies took roots in India because of the predilection for national literatures. So, what has happened in the Indian context is we have tried to understand comparative literature from a strictly Indian national point of view, and we have tried to, we have used comparative literature not to foreground any Western Eurocentric concepts, but to scrutinize the West from without, but to foreground Indian English literature, Indian writing in English. So, comparative literature and cultural studies, both in the Indian context, have a lot of prominence in foregrounding such thoughts where the West can be scrutinized from without. And people like Ganesh Devi, they have and Amiya K. Dev, Sisir Kumar Das, these people have provided a lot of impetus to the way we study our literature using the framework of comparative literature. They have K. Chellapan, some names, Bhalchandra Nemade, all these people, and definitely Professor Tutun Mukherjee, and there are, we have at Jadavpur University, I think, that is probably one of the earliest universities on comparative literature to have taken root in Asian and African countries, Jadavpur University, and they have a journal of comparative literature, which is considered to be one of the most esteemed journals in comparative literature, Jadavpur University. So there a lot of in West Bengal especially, I guess, a lot of activities around comparative literature happened even before Indian independence, and after independence this gained in strength. So throwing light on Indian English literature or Indian writing in English from a comparative cultural studies point of view may be a very naive thing for me to do, because I don't really know whether there is a comparative cultural studies department or a comparative cultural studies option in any parts of in any part of our country, in any part of India. I'm not sure about that, but definitely when people would come to know about, of course we know our culture, but we want others to know about our culture, and comparative cultural studies would definitely throw more light into Indian literature and Indian literary traditions when Europeans, the people outside this culture, take up comparative cultural studies. And that is one way more light is going to fall on Indian English literature from without. The outsiders will look at Indian English literature, and they would try to understand and assimilate the major facets of Indian English literature. What happened with Gandhiji and Thoreau, how Thoreau influenced Indian English literature, no doubt about that. And from our perspective, our knowledge of our literature would definitely be enhanced. Our knowledge of our literature would be would be enriched by comparing our literature with other literatures in a cultural context, especially when it comes to comparative cultural studies. Thank you.
Okay, our next question is by Madam Zuriti Goswami. She wants to know, can we say that the whole idea is to decolonize what theory means?
Decolonize theory?
Yes, sir. Is it so?
I don't think so. And there is no decolonization of theory. However, the thing is, comparative cultural studies doesn't want to colonize or decolonize anything. That is not the perspective, because it speaks about doing things without any hierarchy. There shouldn't be any hierarchy. And when we are doing away with hierarchy, we are actually doing theory. So I think that instead of doing anything with theory, it is a part of theory. Comparative cultural studies is a part of modern literary theory, theory with a capital T, theory that came into prominence with postmodernism and post-structuralism since the 1970s. I'm sure that comparative cultural studies is a part of theory, and it is aiding and abetting the growth of literary theory, if anything. It is not antagonistic to theory. Yeah, comparative literature faced a lot of backlash because of theory. Cultural studies didn't. Cultural studies, the relationship of cultural studies and literary theory, more or less it was a love and hate relationship. But when it comes to comparative cultural studies, I don't think it is a decolonizing. Maybe we can use it in the sense Franz Fanon used the concept of decolonization, decolonizing our minds. Maybe comparative cultural studies is trying to decolonize our minds from centric views to eccentric views. It wants us to do away with privileging, and it wants to its politics is emancipatory politics, bringing the margins to the center. So in that sense, it is its effort will always be towards decolonizing our minds, definitely. That's what I think, but I am not an authority in the area to shed more light on that. Thank you.
Mr. Vyomakisri, he says that when nation as a concept is a construct, regionalism is still a dream. Literature of the
Bilash, could you please repeat? I didn't get you.
Sir, Vyomakisri, he wants to know, when nation as a concept is a construct, regionalism is still a dream. Literature of the margin never holds the center. How can then we say comparative literature is positive?
Is positive?
Yes, sir.
I don't say it is positive. I don't say it is negative. Yeah, regionalism is a dream. But comparative literature has changed its stance every now and then. And I don't know if there is any other discipline that has questioned itself as often as comparative literature has done. I don't know if there is any other discipline in any subject, any area, which has questioned its own identity and existence as comparative literature has done. So comparative literature has had a troubled history. So on the one hand, when we speak about comparative literature from a Western perspective, from a world literature perspective, it is completely against all regional and national considerations. So from that perspective, when you speak about regionalism, it is bad. But when in the towards the end of the 20th century and in early 21st century, comparative literature gained ground in the eastern countries, the Latin American countries, Asia, Africa, then what has happened is comparative literature has helped in the growth of nationalist spirit, has helped in the understanding of regionalism, of area studies. So comparative literature has taken both stands. It has supported regionalism and nationalism, and it has opposed regionalism and nationalism. So in a way, I would say it depends on where it is happening. If comparative literature is happening in the West, then it is against regionalism and nationalism. And if you think of regionalism or nationalism as a dream to be realized, then comparative literature is against that dream. And but if you are looking at comparative literature from the West, from the East, if comparison is happening in the East, then regionalism and nationalism are the very pivot around which comparative literature revolves, and comparative literature tries to give more importance to regionalism and nationalism, not in a narrow parochial view, but to shed more light on our culture by understanding other culture. In that sense, comparative literature has done that. Otherwise, I don't think comparative literature is positive or negative. I think it is it is neutral. Anything is neutral, and it depends on how we use it. Whether it is good or bad, if you have to attach any value to something, then it should depend on how somebody looks at it or what use it is put to.
Next question is by Madam Dhanasri Das. She asks, can cultural studies be biased in terms of application in the global forum concerning the broader lives of people?
Cultural studies theoretically cultural studies doesn't evince any bias against any sort of community or any people, nothing. It tries to bring together low culture and high culture. It tries to bring, reduce the gap between the high and the low and see both from the same lens. These things are done by cultural studies theoretically, but whether it happens practically is a very different question. And we have to admit that cultural studies hasn't fully succeeded in realizing its dreams of emancipatory politics, emancipatory left-wing politics that it had. It couldn't fully realize that potential because obviously whatever happens, whatever we do, there is politics. Politics is everywhere. Even in a depoliticized system or even in an anti-politics system, there is politics. So, cultural studies is never apolitical. It is political. Its political aspirations are for the emancipation of the downtrodden, the marginalized. But unfortunately, it has many a time failed in achieving its ends in enhancing and improving the situation of the marginalized. That is what I think. Yeah.
Sir, we have a few more. Shall we continue?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Next one is by Mr. William Pinto. He asks, if the process of juxtapose takes place so seriously, then why does such inclusivism creeps in?
How does?
If the process of juxtapose takes place so seriously, then why is the presence of inclusivism?
Inclusivism.
Yes, sir.
Juxtaposition. See, you juxtapose two things to shed more light on both. Yeah, I understand. If you do a lot of juxtaposition, if you do a lot of comparison, then wouldn't it lead to narrowness, right? I think that is the idea. Yeah, there is a point in that. For example, we say that we shouldn't compare our children. Don't compare your son with your neighbor's son. There is a problem in comparison because it can lead to narrow hierarchies, and people would be rather uncomfortable with that. However, the purpose, that is where I want you to focus on attention on. The purpose of comparative cultural studies, the focus of comparative cultural studies is on the method itself. Okay, is on the method itself and not what is being compared. Not what is being compared. So, we need comparison in a way to understand both sides. We cannot understand anything on its own. That is why Descartes says, Descartes supported comparison, and he said it is only through comparison we can understand any phenomenon. The famous propounder of Cartesian philosophy, René Descartes, he said that it is only through comparison we can understand anything. Only through comparison. And we know what Ezra Pound had said about comparison. So comparison is a necessary thing, but yeah, it can lead to dilettantism and elitism. A lot of problems can happen because of comparison. So it requires a lot of judicious judgment on the part of the comparatist if it shouldn't fall into such traps. Yeah, inclusivism is very necessary, and comparison is about inclusivism, but too much focus on comparison, on juxtaposition can sometimes lead to narrow-mindedness. That's it.
Okay, sir. The next question is by Sana Tabassum, madam. She asks, can all cultural literary works be studied from the perspective of comparative canon?
Anything. It depends on how you do it. You can, there is nothing like you cannot do something on something. If you have the tools, and if you have the methodology, and if you have the idea, you can work on any text. It needn't be a book. I am saying text in the post-structuralist sense. Anything is a text, any discourse. So it can be done. Comparative study can be done on any text. There is absolutely no problem. There aren't any hard and fast rules regarding that, and it depends on how you do it. Your methodology in itself, nothing is comparisonable or something. There is nothing like that. You can compare if you have something to compare, or if you have some ideas to compare.
Madam Soma Das wants to know, can literature be enjoyed in the true sense of the term when students are asked to apply literary theories?
Can literature be
enjoyed in the true sense of the term when we apply theory?
Yeah, that is a problem. And there are differences of opinion. I know that there are, especially the elder generation, they are against theory. I don't use that in a theoretical sense, but I think they are against theory because they believe that enjoyment is largely affected when we apply a lot of theory, and the bombardment of theory into the curriculum has destroyed literary appreciation. Now nobody is considered with the beauty of the literary artifact. So yeah, there is a problem, but what I would suggest is, anyway literary theory is with us, accept it, and instead of taking it as something tough and formidable and boring, I would want to say that we should look at literary theory as something exciting and challenging. It is a broadening of perspective anyway. Literary theory offers a broadening of perspective, and it definitely offers new tools and new methodologies for us to look at different texts. It gives us different framework, and maybe in a strict sense, a lot of theory can spoil appreciation. A lot of theory can spoil aesthetic enjoyment of a text. But when you look at the way theory is being practiced by people who enjoy literature, I don't think my appreciation of literature, the way I understand and enjoy literature, has been affected in a negative sense by my learning of theory. There was a time when I really thought that literary theory is bad and it is spoiling our literature. That was my lack of understanding. There was a time, we all have that phase when we don't understand anything and we think that, okay, this is bad because I don't understand. But when you understand something, when you realize that it is a tool that enhances your appreciation of literature, then maybe you will not have a problem with literary theory. But too much of anything is bad, and we need a proper balancing of theory, of criticism, and definitely literature.
Okay, then we have our last question. It is by Sahina Madam. She wants to know the differences between cross-cultural studies and cultural studies.
Oh, which studies?
Cross-cultural studies and cultural studies.
It is the same thing. Cross-cultural, it is, we are using different terms, right? Cross-cultural, multicultural, trans.
He wants to know it in the field of literature, sir.
What?
He wants to know it in relation to literature. How can we differentiate the two terms?
Cultural studies and?
Cross-cultural studies.
Cross-cultural studies. I don't know if there is any major, watertight compartmentalization between cultural studies and cross-cultural studies. Maybe Abhilash, you can shed some light on that. I don't know.
Yes, sir. Even I do think that both of them are more or less similar, because whenever we talk about cultural studies, there are some tendencies which can creep in terms of cross-cultural identities. And then we can delve deep into those fields by taking one specific text.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. I don't have much idea about that. Yeah.
Okay, sir. Then we have come to the end of the session. And we have exceeded the time limit by almost an hour. And I would like to apologize to all the participants here. I know that it's Raksha Bandhan today and you all must be waiting for celebrations. But is it bad to learn something more? We all know how great a scholar Manu sir is. So I just hope that you will be forgiving us for exceeding the time limit. And sir, thank you so much on behalf of AIFEST and on behalf of the organizing committee. I would love to extend my thanks from the core of my heart for making your presence felt in terms of an enriching lecture and just making us overwhelmed with your lecture. So thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Abhilash. Thank you so much. Thanks to all the participants for your wonderful cooperation and support right through the lecture. Thank you so much.
And just one more line regarding your feedback forms, dear participants, it will be notified later on the Telegram group. So please kindly be updated. Thank you. Thank you so much.